Inmaculada Rodríguez Piñera. No sé dónde es eso. A ver el nombre. No. Bueno, Inmaculada Rodríguez Piñera. Hola, hola. Antes de comenzar.
Well, before we begin our meeting, I'd like to give the floor to Inmaculada Rodríguez Piñera, who's asked for the floor. Unfortunately, comments off mic which can't be heard. Well, thank you very much for giving me the floor. I've just come from the Women's Forum, and it's been difficult to set up a Women's Forum where we can work and defend the rights of women and in favour of equality. I think the Forum of Civil Society should, when it comes in to take into account the election of the Executive Bureau, gender equality. That's something that we do, and when you want to ensure that the different bureaus of the committees and the different bodies of EuroLat should also take into account gender equality. That's my proposal. Thank you very much.
Bueno, adopción del proyecto de orden del día. Nada más, hay que presentarlo.
Los tres paneles y...
Sí. Ok. Bueno, damos comienzo.
So, can we begin?
Bueno, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Comenzando
So we are beginning our Civil Society Forum meeting, and the first thing we need to do is to adopt the draft agenda. Now the draft agenda has 3 points, there's 3 different panels which have been decided on. Latin American and committee priorities in the Economic and Social Committee, the role of trade union movements in culture in negotiation of Mercosur, the rights LGBTI rights in Latin America and the European Union, and then there's obviously any other business, and then there's a place and date of next meeting. That's the final point on the agenda. Then we also have the approval of the minutes of the last meeting. That was the 4th of the May 2021. There was a meeting held in Brussels in Belgium. And I think that's everything that needs to be said on the draft agenda. And now I'd like to give the floor to my co-chair for the approval of the minutes of the previous meeting. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the hospitality and for the presentation, for your presentation. We began immediately because already we have delay. The draft minutes of the last committee meeting that took place on 4th May 2021 in Brussels, in Belgium, are included in your dossier. Are there any questions relating to the minutes? No, okay. If no modification are received by the end of the meeting, the minutes of the said meeting will be approved as they stand or including in any charges submitted. Dear colleagues, this is the first ordinary meeting with civil society in 2022, and the first non-virtual meeting since the meeting held in Vienna on 17 September 2018. The time available for this meeting being limited, we have only 2 hours. We have to work efficiently to complete the planned agenda. To allow a smooth and effective debate, the following distribution of the floor is proposed. Guest speakers, a maximum of 7 minutes each for the initial presentation and 2 minutes for the reply of questions. Other speakers, a maximum of 2 minutes per participant. The distribution is dictated by the need of interpreter, which will only be provided up to the time the meeting is scheduled to the end. As all the items of the agenda must be dealt with, I ask speakers to strictly adhere to the proposed distribution of speaking time. Lastly, due to the limitation that the semi-remote holding, it's okay. Okay, we start immediately.
Bueno, damos paso al...
So, now let's move on to item 4, priorities of civil society in the European Union, Latin America and the Caribbean relations.
Ok, primero. Un intercambio de puntos de vista.
So this has been an exchange of views over 2 panelists. Firstly, Gerardo Martinez, Secretary of International Relations of CGT, Coordinator of the European Social Consultative Forum of Mercosur of the Argentine National Section. Gerardo. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much to you, Senator. Thank you for giving me the floor. I'd also like to acknowledge all of those colleagues who are part of the this panel and this exchange of views. I will try to give you a summary of what has been and what continued to be the history of one of the first forums that was set up in 1994 in Argentina. This was the Economic Social Consultative Forum, set up in so in the Economic Social Consultative Forum, we set up an advisory body, and this was because we saw this major possibility, major advantage, which was Mercosur. So therefore we set up this advisory body, and this was, we have obviously the different chambers of commerce from business were represented. The chambers of commerce focused on obviously the supply of Argentine products, and also we brought together the different the key trade union movements, so the CGT, the CTA, and the CGT autonomous. Right now, and this is a key point to mention, we include all civil society organizations. Our forum is an open space built to consensus. We try to achieve a path forwards which can create a process of integration. We need to make sure that the Mercosur integration process is always built in a democratic manner, and we need to ensure social inclusion. That's something that's very important. We've used different models and different ways of working with Europe, and I'd like to thank the people who have organised this exchange of views. From the very beginning, we've asked for a specific space to look at labour relations, employment, security and production. The Mercosur Society has a charter of labour rights, and that's an example for everyone. It sets out the ILO recommendations and conventions, and moreover it's a regional instrument which ensures right to strike, and also health rights and security rights, which are currently being discussed in the International Labour Organization. So we want to see these set out as fundamental rights. we have tried to strengthen citizens' rights throughout our work, and we've done this in our advisory forum. We set up a network of cooperatives. Cooperatives have to develop a work agenda based on respect on and socio and labour rights. We also have a specialised network for women, and we've also set up the Institute of Human Rights. We have been able to sign up to social security rights, and we also set up a body to focus on regional employment known as Ganemple. And in our forum, we've also tried to achieve consensus around strengthening external relations with the different commercial blocs that exist. The most well-known one has been the ALCA. This was a regional integration project, but it didn't give us the possibility to discuss socio-labour issues which affected inequality in our regions. The trade union movement across the region, including civil society, was resistant to those areas to try and put an end to ALCA as an integration project. Now, this wasn't because workers and civil societies are against integration projects. We never had the opportunity to sit down and to be involved in the negotiation process, in this integration process. You know, if we need to solve the major problems that we face in our region, then we need to look at level of inequalities, and we need to focus on this. Now, because we weren't involved in this, we couldn't sit down with them. We were in no way involved in any of the protocol, any of the parameters, in any democratic manner. We had no participation in any way at all. So, therefore, we, the trade unions and other groups, were resistant to the ALCA project. In 2005, ALCA was put to bed, if you will. People stopped working on the ALCA project. Now, another example of our position is the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement. Now, in this process, social labour groups and civil society didn't have necessary information. I wanted to say that we've seen a major difference between level of information and consultation that civil society has seen and trade unions within Europe. No, we've seen much better opportunities for these groups in Europe than we have in our region. You know, we didn't understand the little points that set out the definition of the new integration process. The trade union movement, I want to underscore this, for Mercosur is not against any integration project. We're not against anything, but we did work with our colleagues from civil society and trade union in Europe to say that we were not being treated at the same level. We weren't able to have an overarching discussion because we didn't have the same information to be involved in the negotiation, so we weren't being treated correctly. In the Consultative Forum, we've always focused on social dialogue, and with the European Economic and Social Committee, we have a mixed follow-up committee for our work. There's trade unions from both sides, from the European Trade Union Confederation and the Consultative group, have set up a labour forum to provide follow-up to specific topics in relation to employment and creation of decent work as a result of the EU-Mercosur agreement. The world has changed after the pandemic. We've seen the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's different health and food policies being implemented. There's been a change to raw material supplies, and also there's new rules in relation to governance of the supply chain. Now, this I think is going to be all relevant topics for us, because faced with this new situation, we need to decide what kind of mechanisms for dialogue are being proposed. How is EuroLat and ESC and other groups going to sit down and speak together? How are we going to ensure that the aims that we have in our region are discussed, and and how can we ensure that we can be the voice of these demands? Now, we need a human-based approach. This is what the ILO says. So therefore, we need to redesign the relationship which exists between the EU and other different blocs. In a world threatened by war, we need to go back to basic principles, the basic principles of the United Nations and its agencies. We need to promote peace, development, and balance between regions, development cooperation and democracy. Now clearly, with this, what I want to say is that the global trade union movement deplores any action which threatens the life of workers throughout humanity. We believe that after the experience we saw in the Second World War, we are in line with many others when we say that we should find the necessary tools through mutualism to solve our problems in a diplomatic sphere. But after 30 years since the creation of our regional bloc, one thing that we have learned is that the public projects of integration need to be supported with public policy which improve people's livelihoods. So we need to be up to the challenge and set up this dialogue at the institutional level. But for it to be effective, then we need to come up with an action plan which is based on full participation. And I'll conclude with this. We think that in order to achieve a mature, responsible relationship between Europe and Latin America, it is necessary to establish more balanced relationships between the developed countries and our region. We need to take into account the important role of trade unions and civil society. We need to have a follow-up guide, and so that we can continue to focus on our agenda. Our aim is to have democratic regional integration, and which is based on participation. We need to have a sustainable development with peace and social justice, which is something that we need. The path is institutionalized social dialogue, and we work every day to achieve this between the different blocs and the different sectors which are involved in this process of integration.
Thank you. Thank you, Gerardo. Thank you, Gerardo. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Josep Puxo, who is the President of Latin American Follow-Up Committee of the European Economic and Social Committee.
Ya, vale. ¿Funciona?
Is it working? Good. Thank you. Thank you to the two co-presidents. And Mr. Androulakis, thank you for having done everything possible to organize this meeting that's so important to us as representatives of civil society. And first and foremost, I'd like to recognize
Parlamentos de ambos lados.
The role played by the parliaments from both components, and of course the good they do by continually inviting us in accordance with Article 6 to be an observer and also to take the floor on some items on the agenda. Our role in Europe, the European Economic and Social Committee, is a body, as you know. It was a part of the first institutions. It came forth in '58 with the establishment of the European Union as a whole, and is in the treaties, and it is civil society in an organized way. Organized. Why do I say organized? Because there are many different ways of having representation. They're all legitimate. There is a continual organizational shift that takes place, and that is extremely dynamic now because of the influx of social media, and with all that information that is circulating, that's extremely active. And sometimes, well, there's information, but then there is also bad information, and so we know that that is out there, and such is the case. Organized civil society, what it has to do first and foremost to be able to deal with the issues that come down to social, economic, and environmental policy. And as I said yesterday, in the Economic and Political Committee, is the exclusive role of the legitimate representation of parliaments. Any decision that is to be made and that impacts citizens in Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean goes through the necessary purview and monitoring of the institutions that are part of civil society. So you would think that it would just be Twitter that has a more impact than in the medium and long term. And of course, I won't say anything about the immediacy more than the citizens' representation through parliaments. So I wanted to just point that out. Coming down to what we do exactly, it's clear that traditionally, with civil society specifically linked to today, what is happening here in Argentina, where we are today in Buenos Aires, with the civil society, we've had a continual follow-up, and Gerardo has said that, in a very long and unending discussion and negotiation for the Mercosur agreement. Now, Mercosur had many problems, but perhaps the most difficult problem was not just the loss of operations because of pandemic, but also the dismantling of civil society in some of the big players in the agreement, Brazil. And I'm going to say it clearly. Now, in the forum where we had exchanges in all of the areas, in social aspects, but also in business and environmental, the environmental sphere too, they've really made it difficult for us to be able to function properly, and that was because there was a lack of impact assessment of all of the mechanisms, as Gerardo just stated. And very quickly, because I know we want to go to the debate, and yesterday we also had the opportunity to discuss this during the Committee for Economic Policy, and how we have to really bring this long, unending discussion to a conclusion. If we cannot, amongst peers, amongst equals, agree, and I say amongst equals because all of the humanistic and democratic principles, but in many other areas, including culture, for example, we are definitely equals. So if we can't agree as equals, someone else will fill that space. And there should be no doubt the enormous manufacturer and seller, but not purchaser, of manufacturing products, that is China. And China will occupy this space, because if we have any issues of gender, of environmental issues, as well as ILO conventions, that's going to have a huge impact on the second thing. Now, with the cannons turned on our houses, it's also important to have, in the political space, there is this anti-Western sentiment that also can have an impact on the atmosphere. So they say all Western democratic principles as well as market principles. And then that space has taken up much more in Africa, for example, than it did in the past, and not just the mining industry. And there is no space for any other questions in their approach. So in this first introduction, I want to just say that we, within the context of the European Union, the European Economic and Social Committee, agree many times with the Commission, and we give the support then to the Parliament in some criteria that I think could be relevant for everyone, if not interesting. We know that there is a document that we are currently working on, and we will provide it to you on the social-economic situation in Latin America as we see it in the post-COVID period, and the role of civil society in the recovery. So we will share that work that we've carried out to you, because we saw, well, we were navel-gazing at the beginning, and COVAX took a really long time to get up and running, but finally we were able to do that, and we had good vaccination rates and relatively acceptable situation in terms of the pandemic, we're just beginning that aspect of the exiting of the pandemic when we had two big shocks, Ukraine and then the supply chains as well. Now we had, of course, the Suez blockade that had a huge impact on the supply chains, and then we have the Shanghai port that has been closed, that's been going on for a while, and that has tripled the cost, but has also lengthened the transit periods of time. And so that means that even the most pessimistic amongst us said, well, this spring the sun will come out and then we'll be able to deal with the traffic and the timeframes for that, but then the impact of the pandemic on energy and on food, well, with Ukraine, that has only gotten worse, and that is placed on the table. Essentially, it's a question of life or death. Now, I don't want to take more of your time, but I hope, of course, that you will look at the document once I provide it to you and assist the joint Parliamentary Assembly in areas of Mercosur and civil society in Europe. We are not giving up, and we'd like to try to continue to participate with all sides, and specifically with Latin America and Caribbean in our midterm and long-term challenges. We are not going to give up the Green Deal. We will not give up our fight against climate change. We will defend the Paris Agreement, but we are not naive, and we know that there's been this huge economic impact in terms of food deficit and energy, and that has to be resolved. And that needs to be done not just in one way, but in full transparency with mechanisms that are temporary and transitional, and then follow the path of defending social rights, environmental rights, and the absolute need to continue to keep that position of leadership. And I think that we specifically need to look to that in civil society on both sides, in both components. Now, many other subjects, of course, following the French elections after the 24th of April, we should have one of the solutions in terms of the blockade of Mercosur on the European side, because it's an obstacle, a political obstacle. I can say that, but of course governmental representatives can say that. This was a political obstacle because of the loss of competitiveness of the inefficient manufacturing system in France, and that meant that there was a constant blockade and the lack of update of the association agreement with Chile, and also the systematic blockade that had a real impact on vaccines. Also was the issue of Brexit. And then one last point, we know then once we finish the elections in France, then we'll have the elections in Brazil, of course. So I would go back to what I said at the outset. If we aren't able to come up with agreements like this, others will, and they will fill in that space, and it'll probably be the kids on the other side of the Pacific, so not just looking on both sides of the Atlantic, but the other side of the Pacific that will be leading the way. That is what our will is, and we want to have the consistent dialogue with civil society, with the Latin American and Caribbean component, and to work in the most coordinated way possible in all things there related. Thank you, Chair.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Joseph. The time has now come for questions and comments. I'd like to give the floor to anyone who would like to take it at this time for that purpose.
Adelante. Presentarse, por favor.
Go ahead and please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, dear honorable co-chairs. I'm Udo Bullmann from Germany, member of EuroLat, and in the European Parliament, member of the Development Committee as well as the Committee for International Trade. Let me start by a remark and then add a question to the podium, to the panelists, especially I'm interested in the trade union view here. I'm deeply convinced that partners who know each other very well, under the wave of shocks, massive shocks, sometimes redetect their mutual attractiveness. And if I have a look at the crisis in this world, especially COVID, afterwards the Ukraine war, I'm totally convinced that Latin America as well as the European Union will redetect the chances of collaboration very soon. And I hope for a boost of this energy in collaboration and for a better future that improves the efforts and improves also the successes for both sides. I have the following question, especially to colleague Martinez and all the others who would like to come in. What exactly do you need in procedural terms to be better involved in trade negotiations? What do you concretely expect in the procedures, and what are your two main points on the content? Because I am an advocate of the opinion that trade union voices, labor voices have to be heard, unless we will not be successful in what we are hopefully going for to achieve. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I'm from the European Economic and Social Committee and also part of the Internal Advisory Committee in the European Union with Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. I'd like to put a question to Martinez and also Mr. Puxeo, because we're often stuck when it comes to trade unionists that have been assaulted, sometimes in Ecuador, in Peru, and specifically the lack of consultation in Ecuador. Now, this is unacceptable because we have clear legislation in Europe, and we love bananas from Ecuador, and we have really good relations in Romania. We have good relations ever since the communist period. And I think that something needs to change on that point. And therefore, I'd really like to hear from the members of Parliament what we can do from a political standpoint to change that. Because often we hear that Colombia has political will when it comes to fighting the assaults against trade unions, but we haven't actually seen the results. And so from that perspective, I'd like to ask you all to give your input on that point. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Gerardo, would you like to take that? Yes, thank you, Alfredo. Both questions are extremely interesting, and I'm sure more could even come forth for many of the colleagues that are part of the European Economic and Social Committee or the Trade Union Council. It's difficult to understand that the governance in our region still has not tangibly taken the form of institutionalized social dialogue. And permanently, from different trade unions and civil society, we consistently put forth this need. And the governments, above and beyond the nuance and their political slant in our region, understand that it's so important to have an institutional approach to social dialogue. They failed to see that. Why do I say institutionalized? Because frequently it's been done discretionally on a voluntary basis, where we were waiting for a decision to be made. A specific minister, for example, would then convene that dialogue, or even the president of the country would, and do that unilaterally without actually making it a government policy. So we would be called discretionally, and there would be no real rights and obligations that applied. And then the practice of the social dialogue, well, since it was on a discretionary basis, it was voluntary. And so some would say, okay, so-and-so can enter, and there was a roadmap for following up on the subjects that we were to discuss, and that little by little we would agree on or resolve. For the same reason, not just in this case of the integration agreement between Europe and Mercosur, but even between countries from Europe and Latin America. When there's an agreement between two countries that can have social and labor impacts, because of course we know that there's interest, there's friendship, and a structural and political approach, of course, but everyone is defending their own side. And that is why we think the entire sectoral representation should at least have the same level of information and decision-making capacity, stand on equal footing, as it were. And that's why when we came up with the agreement, the political administration plan in Argentina, we were not frequently able to understand the conditions that were imposed during the negotiation. And sometimes we would see that we would talk with our friends from the European Union and with the trade unions in France. They would give us information as to what the conditions were, and that it would actually create more inequality, less inclusion, less social protection, and fewer possibilities to improve our rights and the opportunities in the societies that we represent. Turning to the point in what's happening in our region, and that's related to what our colleague said. And we spoke of Ecuador. We could have spoken of Guatemala. Well, it's an unequal region when it comes to trade union rights. 3 times a year, I listen to what the claims are, what the demands are, what the complaints are from many trade unions and individual workers, how they are oppressed, kidnapped, or even killed. We've had leaders who have been killed by hired killers, and that the investigation would go nowhere to bring the person to justice. So looking at the civic and civil rights and the structural and institutional rights. So essentially, we're really concerned about that, of course. In our region, we have the Trade Union Confederation of Latin America, and every single time we have a chance, we ask for that freedom for organized labor and trade union, and the recognition by the governments, and an end being put to any type of persecution, and to prosecute any cases of death, which does happen in a lot of countries, not just Ecuador, which was one that was named. Then we know there's the issue of bananas and cocoa. We know many of us the best chocolate in the world comes from there, but the raw material can come from other places too, and we know what the consequences then are in a country like Ecuador.
Última pregunta.
The final question. Yes, good afternoon. My name is André Lelohoite from the Argentine Central Workers, from part of the Central Forum. And I'll try and be very brief. I think I echo everything my colleague Gerardo Martinez has said, but just have one question, or rather a thought and then a question. So we have this pre-agreement has been closed, as we see things, for more political reasons rather than because there's been a consensus which has been achieved. For example, the effects of the agreement was signed. Then there was a study done on the impacts afterwards. We thought that there was also certain delays with this agreement as well. This agreement was a cooperation and development agreement, not now that we're talking about last generation or next generation free trade agreement, and I don't want to go on at length. The question is as follows: what can EuroLat do to try and change change the agreement, to try and reopen the agreement so that everyone can have more involvement? Because as clearly as Geraldo says, we're not against the agreement, but we don't agree with the fact that it's already been signed in the state that it is, because we think it's going to lead to uneven levels of development, and it's not going to achieve the aims that it's trying to. Thank you very much. Joseph Puchel, please.
Que no funciona. Sí, ahora? Sí.
Yes, I think the microphone's working now. Thank you, co-chairs. It's difficult to summarise that in 1 minute. I don't want to run over. Yesterday in the Economic Committee had quite a lot of time to talk about multilateralism, but that would be useful today. So 2 questions from Didru Fornea to speak of the situation of trade unions in Colombia. Well, our analysis of the situation, of the crisis situation, has been, we've had an economic crisis in 2008, the COVID pandemic. There is insecurity in Colombia, which has an impact on the whole area, more so than in other areas at a global level. This is often the outcome, lack of democratic instruments in these countries, and at times it's because of the extreme violence, at times through organized crime and drug trafficking. No, you know this. We think that trade unionists are the weakest collectives from north and to south. Obviously, women as well are very vulnerable. Trade unionists, but also environmental defenders, journalists have been affected, and small and medium business owners as well. So this is a process of degradation, which is a lack of instruments to strengthen democracy and to strengthen the rule of law in many countries in the region. This weakness then is transformed into violence against the weakest in society. Now, something that needs to be corrected, and the European Union should strain every sinew and go beyond traditional cooperation to support the fight against this violence. We as civil society, as an absolute minimum, we should denounce and raise these issues, and then if we can have a more active policy in this area as well, we should do. The second question, Andres, the agreement is well, if we sign this agreement, it's nonsense, and the Chinese will move in. It's to be useless in social and environmental terms. We as civil society, we need to demand that there's changes. We need to make people address this. That this agreement is not finalised. The document notionally is finalised, but the political side to it is very important. The politics has a much more important role than traditional agreements, and some people say that there's a risk, or some people say it's impossibility to split the trade the trade agreement from the political agreements, and then obviously they could move forward just on economic issues, but that the political part is where civil society is involved, and that would be the new component of new association agreements at a European level. Now, I don't want to repeat the debate from yesterday, but this is a question of multilateralism, and it would be the World Trade Organization who should be doing this. But just to give you an example, and I apologize for running over time here, the Trump administration undermined many multilateral bodies, above all the WTO. the appellate bodies and mediation bodies were not renewed, so there's a major problem now. They've been completely undermined, the multilateral bodies. So how do we, what was the solution been? To try and find regional agreements. We shouldn't be drawing up regional agreements, but the multilateral bodies don't have the power to be able to do so. And so that's why we have these regional agreements. We're looking at where we can draw up agreements from an EU point of view. The EU should continue trying to do so. But the best thing would be a growth in multilateralism, which at the end of the day means that we don't need to strengthen the regional agreements, but we do need to strengthen institutional democratic institutions. The risk that things don't move forward is very high, and I'm very pleased that you as trade unions in the Mercosur continue to insist on this, saying that it is necessary, hopefully, with transparency, with information, with a democratic control, this can turn out to be something positive, and it's not just a trade agreement that some people would love to see. Thank you.
No, muchas gracias.
Yeah, thank you, Josep. So now we need to move on with our agenda, move on to the next panel. Unfortunately, one of the panelists is ill, and so Victor Santamaria can't be with us today, but we do have Alfredo Belliz, member of the Mercosur Parliament, Secretary General of the Trade Union of Commercial Employees from Chubut in Argentina. Mr. Belliz will speak about the role of trade union movement in culture in the context of the Mercosur negotiation. Yes, thank you, Senator. Good afternoon to everyone. It's very important to add this topic to the discussion today. We in Palo Sur always make sure we focus on everything. You know, given the COVID pandemic, there's lots of work that still needs to be done, but we need to focus on employment and social affairs and society at large. We've been having a very interesting debate in the Palo Sur, and we wanted to bring it to EuroLat. We thought it could be a way of achieving agreements and conventions, and we also want to look at what can be done. The entire society has been affected by the COVID-19 crisis. We've had difficulties, we still have difficulties. And the debate that people have been talking about is the post-pandemic world. Employment, decent employment. How do we put an end to inequalities? This is a debate that has been mentioned already. The Vice President said this morning that it shouldn't just be to legislative or judiciary, everyone should be involved in reducing inequalities. We need to look at how we draw up policies which are agreed on, where there's consensus from business associations and trade unions. That allow us to leave the crisis behind. In our region, I'm talking about the Mercosur Parliament here, there are certain countries where minimum wages don't meet people's needs. There's also a huge amount of informal work. So we need to have a debate on policy, so we need to have an exchange of views with business owners. We live in a globalized world, but we say that we've also suffered from the pandemic, and the workers and employment should be better remunerated. We need to see the economy grow, but obviously workers should be should be growing as well and should be remunerated for this. So in the Mercosur Parliament, we've been working on this, working in the Employment Affairs Committee, chaired by my colleague Victor Santamaria. We're looking at the post-pandemic world, we're speaking to the different countries. We want to be unified and take the necessary measures that are required. We need to drive the economy forward again, and if we are in the correct conditions, we can discuss this in Parliament. We believe that we will give the trade union movement to have a parliament where they can be heard. If we have in a post-pandemic world a situation where workers have decent employment, then people will build on this. At times in discussions, we hear that the trade union movement has the opportunity to express its views. And it's very significant for us to say we don't need poor quality employment. We don't need to come out of a pandemic with very low wages or very informal work. We need to see growth and development with workers within the system, with workers involved in the discussion, involved in the policies. And we need to look at the social economy. We need to think about how we can look at what the possibilities we have for growth. Are we prepared for the post-pandemic world? Are governments ready? Are legislators ready? Are we ready in the Parliament to say, are we ready to restore confidence in public policy, in politics? And that can be done through a decent employment. And that's a discussion that needs to be had. We need to be ready to have this discussion. And when people are talking about the post-pandemic world, whatever people are talking about the post-pandemic world, we need to ensure that workers and trade union leaders are involved in that discussion so that we can focus on a range of different policies so they can achieve social justice in the post-pandemic world. We need to ensure decent, dignified work for people. So that's what we're discussing in the in the Mercosur Parliament, and I wanted to bring it here to this space for debate, and obviously employment and decent employment. Microphone for the speaker, please.
Adelante.
Please go ahead.
Gracias. Buenas tardes.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. Nedis Laguna from the Central American Parliament, specifically I'm from Honduras. We in the region are keen for investment to create employment. We also have mass migration in Central America. We have Central Americans, Caribbeans moving towards the United States and at times towards Europe as well. At times we have very high levels of investment from Europe, for example, from the United States, from Canada. However, this investment is just used to privatize our forests. Where forests are sold off and they're used for the extractive industry, for metals and minerals that's then taken to Europe. We're seeing our rivers being privatized to create electricity and to sell it back to us. We see electricity being sold back to us at very, very high, unaffordable prices. People are organizing smallholder farmers, indigenous groups. The result of that is that hundreds and hundreds of people who have been put in prison for defending forests and defending water. We also have victims across Central America. Many people have died. Brothers and sisters who have been courageous in Honduras, with its perhaps the most well known is Berta Cáceres. There have been others as well, but I think you might know the name of Berta Cáceres. There's also many people who are in prison. Apparently those who are responsible have been put in prison. However, those who organised it walk free. Now, a lot of these projects are being financed by European banks. European banks finance many projects, and there's very little investment coming from national sources. These are it is foreign investment in our country. My question would be, how, as European parliamentarians, how can you have some impact on European capital so that there is investment in our region, but not in the manner in which it's currently being done? Thank you. Please go ahead.
Alejandro Carle, Parlamento.
Alejandro Carle from the Mercosur Parliament from Argentina. I'd like to congratulate all of the panelists and other speakers as well. When we said that the trade union movement should be in EuroLat, well, that's something we wanted to see, and this is the reality. So I'm very pleased to see that this meeting's taken place. The trade unions need to be here in the Civil Society Forum. Employment also needs to be discussed in some of the committees on a permanent basis. For example, I think the Civil Society Forum should also be more present in some of the committees. Without a doubt, we live in a world of asymmetries in Europe and Latin America. The symmetry in the world of work is very, very large. There's something we do share between Europe and Latin America. We can produce together. Europe is an integrated bloc. There is the project that is the EU. I think European business leaders, and similar to what my colleague was saying, we need to provide incentives so that we work together and we produce together. We in Argentina, we also have certain provinces that are very rich in raw materials and with this huge added value. But I come from a province where 50% of the population go hungry. But we have food. We have rice. We have maize. But with huge agricultural area, we're the largest livestock area, but we don't have ports to export our products. We don't have train. We don't have gas. We don't have motorways. We don't have refrigeration facilities. So this asymmetries exists in our countries. Above all, in the north of Argentina, there are many problems. However, here we're looking at policies in the area of integration. I have faith, but also I have hope. I hope that Europe can look at those regions in Argentina which are rich in raw materials, and hopefully Europe can invest in these areas and we can invest with us and produce with us. I think obviously if we can have the involvement of the trade union movement as well, that would be fantastic. I think we're going to have this is a before and after period when obviously this negotiation has been ongoing 20 years, and we need to see trade unions more involved in it. So thank you for sharing this information with us. Thank you for being here, and thank you for continually raising this topic in relation to discussions we have with the European Union.
Aquí, por favor, el micrófono.
Thank you. Microphone over here, please.
Perdón. ¿Sí?
Gracias.
Adelante. Perdón.
Gracias, mis compañeras.
Thank you to my female colleagues, Liliana Paguana, and I am here as a representative of civil society. We are a network of networks, a platform, and we have 1 million square meters in Brazil, Bolivia, and Uruguay, and Argentina. Argentina is a big driver in the link. 300 organizations of CSOs that represent women, rural women, indigenous communities, trade unions, and farmers. Well, we are always crying, but we decide to have a political impact, and to link up. And so we have a message. And thank you, therefore, to EuroLat for having invited us, because we would otherwise be back home. And so we come from there to bring attention to this important space that we have. And our message has nothing more than to be said with this connection that we need to have good public services, good public goods. What does that mean? All of us, wherever we come from and what we do as a part of civil society, we come from our local communities in universities, business, technology, innovation, and as well the government, as well, the executive and legislative branch. And so they maintain our rights. And this good quality public good, that's the impact that we're aiming for, and we're really pleased. Now, with our colleagues from Mercosur and the delegation from Argentina, we are working on giving impetus to having a representation, and with our Spanish and Argentine representative that's here, to hope to be able to have impact in Europe too. So we want to be able to bring the sum of all of our efforts together and get the information to the local communities on these negotiations that you're carried out. We don't know how precisely this is going to affect us, and that not having information will not be good for us. So we're working all together to try to make sure that that information deficit doesn't exist. Thank you.
Ahora sí.
¿Funciona? Sí.
Does it work? Seems so. I have a question and a comment that I'd like to put to my colleague from Honduras that spoke before me. Could you introduce yourself, please? Soraya Rodriguez from the European Parliament, from the Liberals and Democrats, Renew Europe, and from Spain, clearly.
Yeah.
In relation to the first speech that was made about leaving behind the pandemic and the situation of workers, we can see that workers suffered greatly because of the measures used to fight the pandemic. But there is a sector that suffered twice over, women, and that was true in Europe. Women they lost more jobs, and they had to take on many more responsibilities with care at home, and the informal sector. Well, women are more present in the informal sector. So it would be great if you could tell us more about what the situation is in Latin America, how you see the situation currently, and how you see the situation of women workers, as well as the representation that they have in the various organizations and sectors. There's no woman on the panel that could answer the question, but perhaps somebody would be able to give us information on this. And then when it comes to the question that you raised, you asked us European parliamentarians directly. We understand very well the situation that many environmental activists are experiencing in Latin America, that they're often putting their life on the line for their courageous efforts, and we support everything we can. But we're also cognizant of the fact that we could establish a high standard of protection for our investment, and that this one of the biggest legislative proposals that came out of the Commission, and that was on due diligence for European companies, and it means that there should be a standard level of environmental protection, but also protection of the human rights that we will demand. And that meant we could make progress. We also did more in forestry to make sure that supply chains are clear and transparent. And that means that we will be able to know what we're buying at any point, where it came from, and how it was produced or extracted in the environmental conditions, but also the labor conditions. I wanted to raise this because these are things that are not easy to achieve, but we're not investors like from elsewhere. There are great investment being made from Europe here, and there are other investors that don't have this much protection, and this is obviously integrated in the third generation trade agreements that have sustainable development chapters as well as labor and human rights. And so we're really trying to integrate all of these things, and I think the businesses in Europe are working at that as well as our authorities. Thank you.
¿Alguien más?
One more person, I think, was hoping to take the floor.
Okay. No? No?
Hola. Hola.
Hello, I'm Monica Silvana from the Socialists S&D group, and I wanted to very briefly speak and turn to our colleague from Honduras and to reply to what he said, because I think what he said with the Guapinol case, we really did follow up on that case carefully. Three politicians were really following up the Guapinol case in terms of their efforts and everything that is being experienced in that region, everything related to persecution of environmental activists. So specifically, our group, the socialist groups, as well as the Greens and Tilly Metz and the left, the three of us followed up on that case consistently. We were in contact with the family on a daily basis. They've now been freed, but they have to continue their activism. So 2 years it took. So I wanted to really point out this fact, what is happening in Honduras, what is happening in Central America and Latin America. That has a direct correlation of what some of the members of the European Parliament are doing that are absolutely committed to defense of the environment in Latin America. My colleague, colleague from Renew also mentioned to the due diligence aspect, and that there is a opinion from the Development Committee to make sure that any type of forestry product is in line with the environmental values that we want to protect, and that the Green Deal has to be carried out with respect for rights of individuals and the environment. So we are committed to this as a political group, the Socialist Group. We will continue to follow up on this, and in the case, the Guapinol case, we have continued to give that case voice in the European Parliament, just to draw your attention to that. Thank you.
Okay. Bueno.
Thank you very much. Alfredo, did you want to add a comment? Just one thought, and state that yes, the pandemic really has been a burden for everyone, a punishment for everyone, women, men, everyone. And in what we aim to do from our standpoint is to enhance dignified jobs in the post-pandemic. We know, yes, women suffered, families suffered, workers suffered, and as business rebuilds the economy, we need to focus then on what can be done. At Parla Sur, we've always done that. Equal pay for equal work. We've said that women, we can't lose sight of the fact that women have all of the same rights as any worker. This is something that has been clearly and openly discussed. Also, Parla Sur and the extended rights of women, that's something that's been consistently brought forth. And also analyzing that, as the colleague from Spain put it, I think that it's timely and it's good to be addressing these subjects. Thank you. We'd like to conclude now the panel. We'd like to take all of the things that have been brought forth throughout the course of the entire discussion this afternoon and make sure that they're consistently mainstreamed into our action at EuroLat.
Bueno, cambiamos de panelistas y desde ya les...
Now change the panel and thank you those who were a part of these two panel discussions.
Perfecto. Tenemos que ser un poco...
Sí, hay que ser... ¿Dónde están los panelistas? Oh. Dos. Helmut. No viene. Helmut. Son dos panelistas. Alba. Quiñones no está. No está. No está.
Pero hay otra persona más, ¿verdad?
No.
Sí, eran tres.
Sí, Goldar.
¿Y está?
Sí.
Okay.
7 minutos.
Bueno, veremos.
Porque a las 8 se corta la traducción y nos echan.
¿7 para todos o solo para mí?
No, 7 para vos.
Porque acá hablaron varias.
No, 7 para vos, abrimos el panel y después vemos.
Vale.
No está. Es él, yes. Y no está. Not here, yes.
Pero hay alguien más, ¿verdad? Sí.
No te preocupes. Yo no sé si tienes que firmar algo. Igual vas a estar por acá.
Sí, estoy en segundo piso.
Dale. Helmut. Si se llegan a ir o algo, saca las cosas mías está mi cartera y una bolsa al lado en el segundo. El segundo lo pueden empezar a desarmar.
No, vos también. O sea, van a empezar a desarmar.
Ok, bueno, pero ¿hay alguien en el segundo nuestro?
Sí, están las chicas.
Ok. Eso si querés darle, no sé, ya se fueron. Ahora vemos.
Yo estoy.
No, el resto.
Perdón, ¿te sobraba unos cositos acá?
Estos.
No, este lo pidió.
No, Cornejo se va.
Está bien, porque es la control de DNI.
Sí.
Fue el aparato acá y fue.
Bueno. ¿Arrancamos? Ya. Si no...
Mandé a ver si realmente están en la oficina. Si están en la oficina, bajo. Si no, en el segundo piso y estamos en el cuarto, ¿no?
En el sexto. Pero bajan rápido.
We are continuing now with the sixth topic, LGBTI rights in Latin America and the European Union. Dear colleagues, in general, it can be said that in the EU and Latin America, there is a trend towards improving the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people grouped under the acronym LGBTI. However, setbacks were again recorded in some countries. The rights of the LGBTI community have often been strengthened by the jurisprudence of the highest courts. The judgment of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which ruled on January 10, 2018, that same-sex couples' marriages must be recognized, was groundbreaking. The judgment is binding on the 20 states in the region that have submitted to jurisdiction of the court. Now we continue and with Fernando Calder, Legal Program Officer for Latin America of the International Institute on Race, Equality and Human Rights, and Alba Rueda, trans activist, Undersecretary of Diversity Policies of the Ministry of Women. You have the floor for 7 minutes, please.
¿Es aquí? Sí.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I'd just like to clarify one point. Up until a month ago, I was part of the Undersecretary of Diversity Policy of the Ministry of Women, Gender and Diversity of Argentina. I'm not anymore, so up until a month ago I was. As a trans activist, as an activist for rights in our community, I do have a vast experience that I can draw on and also reflect and share views. So first thing I'd like to do is to thank everyone who is present here. I'd also like to call for agenda for LGBTQI plus people. This is in Latin America, in the countries of the global south. You know, it's linked to human rights context. The human rights paradigm in Argentina has been the way we've been fighting for our rights. So this is how we build our social movements, lesbian, all the different movements that we have here built on that. And it's important to look at this and say that this is something that we always need in those agreements, not just agreements, but agreements and dialogues which build a democracy, and which is the space of a parliament. We have achieved certain milestones achieved certain milestones. We don't have a binding relationship with the. We don't have a binding agreement with the state, but we have a charter. We set this out. within a very short space of time, on the 9th of May, we're going to celebrate the first 10 years of the law of gender identity, which translates a lot of these principles, and these have been worked on by social organisations. So the first point I'd like to highlight is that the vast majority of these points are all linked to social struggles, and social struggles are the same around the world. If we have a human rights view, obviously there needs to include these principles at international level, at the local level, in Latin America and across Ibero-America. For example, the right to gender identity, as this should be, as we can't say that people cannot have their identity. We need to have a recognition of our identities in all countries, and this is without any other criteria of judicialization or an evaluation. Or it's not the state that gives you an identity. We identify ourselves. We know who we are. We express that every single day, fighting. We are activists, and the state needs to act in an administrative manner to ensure that our rights, our fundamental rights, are respected. And I'd like to say that the regulation around equality is here, but we cannot forget the major achievements that we've had, which are outside of public policy. Today, public policy in our country also allows to move forward in the exercise of these rights, so that it's not civil servants who are deciding what kind of decisions are being taken. It's absolutely vital in this way to smash the patriarchy here. We need to have a feminist and a trans-feminist approach here. The patriarchy has two faces, not just misogyny, but also phobia of Lgbti community, and it means we have to act in many different ways. In Argentina, one of the major achievements that we've made is recognition of non-binary identities, and this is not just in relation to assignation of different categories, but it's also vital that all institutions can remove the patriarchy and move beyond this binary system which creates subjects and splits people into men and women. We need to recognize the diversity of sexual identity within institutions and within society, and this is absolutely vital for us to achieve our aims. And this needs to be done in formal terms, but also in the day-to-day terms, in all institutions, in hospitals, in prisons, in all of our rights. The recognition of identity is one of the fundamental bricks, but the impact of the patriarchy is not just a correct question of recognition of formal rights, it's also economic inequalities, and this is a key point for us here in Latin America, in Argentina. We need to work on poverty from a gender perspective and diversity perspective. We need to underscore the fact that the trans community are the most vulnerable and marginalised. There's a huge amount of crimes because of prejudices and etc., etc. And this is something that happens in other countries as well. We know about debates, conversion therapies, which today people are talking about, and it's something we have addressed in our country with a law on mental health. It says that, but this needs to be exercised through life conditions, and also with a perspective that is built on public policies. So the 2030 agenda with diversity should be set as one of the viewpoints, so that we can develop the SDGs. We're putting an end to poverty, gender equality, well-being, etc., etc., peace, justice, solid institutions. These are all aims we need to achieve, but this need to be done within the actual context of the society and our community that we live in. So we also think that this 2030 agenda should have a focus on diversity. So what challenges do we face here in Argentina? We also need to translate these major achievements we've had in formal recognition of public policy into the actual reality. We need to ensure there's transfeminist justice. We need to ensure there is a perspective which supports our rights. We need to have cooperation and support of community at large, and that needs to be an international community and Latin American community to support our community. Now, for your final words, we need to underscore the role of political participation of LGBTQI people is vital. They can represent our interests, but they will also help us to think about democracy and think about democracy from a true point of view. If an institution does not represent its people, then it's not looking towards its people. We need to see in all public spaces that LGBTQI people who are visible taking decisions, such as in this this space, which is EuroLat.
Thanks a lot, Alba. The floor to Fernando, please.
Buenas tardes. Muchas gracias.
Good afternoon, and thank you for organising this space. I'll give you state of play on the LGBTQI situation in Argentina. The NGO I work for tries to protect human rights, and we work with local activists in Latin America and elsewhere to promote and protect the human rights of marginalized communities. This could be because of the racial, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. No, race and equality are key points, and that when we look at human rights in Latin America and the rights of people with, we need to look at the rights of different sexual orientations. The Inter-American Court on Human Rights said that discrimination against people, the LGBTI people, or those perceived as such, is closely linked to the existence of societal prejudices and cultural prejudice, which are linked to the American cultures. Violence based on prejudice is a concept which leads to understanding violence as a social phenomenon which is against other types of violence. This type of violence requires a context and social complicity. It's directed at certain groups such as LGBTQI people, for example, and it has a symbolic impact. Moreover, when this type of violence is directed towards a people or group of people, it sends a clear and strong message to all of the LGBTQI community. And first and foremost, I wanted to mention a few positive aspects of LGBTQI people in Latin America. We've seen that change is possible. There was a ruling in 2022 from the Constitutional Court in Colombia said that non-binary identity now needs to be recognized in documents. Now, there's also the historic recognition of LGBTQI people in the peace agreements in Colombia. In Brazil, the High Court interpreted the fact that the law needs, the mere opinion needs to be applied on gender violence should be applied to trans women as well. We're also seeing laws of this type in Argentina, so hopefully we'll continue to have progress in this area. For example, there's a law on family in Cuba which recognizes same-sex marriage. However, unfortunately, there are still certain problems which lead to recurrent violations of human rights, right to life. There's also extrajudicial executions. There's also the violation of the right to integrity. There's torture and violence, above all, in a range of different areas. There's also rape and different types of sexual violence. There's violation of right to freedom, there's no access to justice as well. Moreover, there's also violation of the right to education, right to culture, right to health, and right to work. Latin America is the region where most trans people are killed for just being trans. This is in line with figures from Transgender Europe in 2021. 70% of murders of trans people occurred in Latin America, and from that 70%, 33% took place in Brazil. Brazil has the highest level of trans mortality rate. In 2021, 140 trans people were killed, and a significant part of these people were Afro-descendant trans. This is a clear example of the intersectionality of multiple vulnerability and risk factors when it comes to discrimination. It's a reality which is not made visible in our community, which leads to impunity. These people are subject to racism, even in own LGBTQI spaces, and prejudice for many different reasons in the Afro-descendant region. So there's a double discrimination, which other factors can be added to it as well, for example, being female or being poor. We also need to say that in the region there's a lack of information and disaggregated data in relation to LGBTQI people. It's absolutely vital to have disaggregated data so we can really look at what challenges people are looking at and have an effective response from governments in relation to recognition of their rights. A clear example in the region is as follows. There's the hate speech which is used against LGBTQI people, and also in those laws around this area. Currently, there are ongoing legal proceedings which are trying to legalize hate speech. For example, a law in Guatemala, for example, which would say that it would be illegal to speak about gender identity in schools or in the media, or a second law in Peru which said that the Ministry of Education would not have an autonomous role when it comes to teaching gender. In Cuba, we've also we're extremely concerned that the state is restricting the right of association for LGBTQI collectives. This leads to many problems for society at large. Our counterparts have documented many arbitrary detentions and also other problems for those people who are involved in the LGBTI community and trying to raise awareness about these problems. These responses from law enforcement affect the right to personal freedom. They also affect the right to association and freedom when detentions are being as a result of peaceful protest. Now, all of these situations are very serious for themselves, but this is exacerbated by the COVID pandemic over recent years. So the situation of LGBTI people in the situation are even worse now. We have the historic inequalities which have been exacerbated. So on behalf of the thousands of people who we represent, we call on governments in the region to meet their international requirements. And I'll close with this. We see we need to give people hope, and we see this in certain political decisions, and we see that with the political will, that structural change is possible. What these people need now is just to be treated like any other citizen in our society, not being murdered because they're trans, not being sacked because they're lesbians. They want to be represented in census and statistics. They want to be recognized in accordance with their gender identity and the sexual orientations. And finally, they want to see their rights to be respected as if they were human beings who had human rights.
Thanks a lot, Fernando. And now the floor to other members for 2 minutes, please.
Merci. In English for the understanding of everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank the chairs for having accepted to put this point at our agenda. The fact is that I think that EuroLat never addressed this topic before. This has been discussed during the Women Forum just before. That was really interesting, and we see that we probably have something to see between these two fora on this point. There is one thing that unites our two regions, two continents, is common values which are freedom and the fight against discrimination. So we must face, and you have described this really well, is that we are facing something that is better. This is the increase of rights, of freedom in some area. This is the case for same-sex marriage, for the trans right, for the convention therapy ban, which is, for example, in my country now a law that has been passed less than 1 year ago. But in the same time, there is the increase of LGBT phobic, hate speeches, hate crimes. And sometimes these come from the institutions, these come from politics. We have the case in Europe, in Poland, in Hungary. We have the case here in Brazil. These are questions we have to address. So my question to the two speakers, and I would like to thank you really a lot for your intervention. What you're describing is that you can live discrimination because of the law, but you can also live discrimination because of the society, because something which is informal. How do you see, on which part do we need to work the most right now to ensure the reality of the freedom of being who you are, who we are, who we love, well, to be simply the person we are. So the question is maybe not easy, but this is my question.
Yeah. Oh.
Well, wait, sorry, I'm Pierre Carleskind, member of the European Parliament, Renew Europe.
Yes, thank you for the floor. And my name is Mark Angel. I'm from the European Parliament from Luxembourg and a member of the Socialist and Democrat group. And in the European Parliament, I am the chair of the Lgbti intergroup. We have an intergroup of 157 members who are defending LGBTI rights. Of course, they are not all gay, lesbians, bi, or trans persons, but they are allies. And I want to say this allyship is very important. And I give you an example about allyship, which is even broader. Pierre is the vice president of that intergroup, and he came with a resolution a year ago declaring the European Union an LGBTI freedom zone as a reaction to the LGBTI free zones in Poland. And this resolution was voted by 498 MEPs out of 705. So this allyship is very important, and therefore I call on parliaments in Latin America, create also an intergroup or a caucus. In America, it's in Washington, they call it the LGBTI caucus in the Congress. But it's important to have groups to defend LGBTI rights. And because we are facing the same enemy, the anti-gender movement, very well financed, internationally very well organized. Finances come from American evangelical movements, and you have these movements in Latin America too. So this anti-gender movement is first attacking LGBTI people, and then they go to women's rights. It's a pattern, and therefore it's very important to continue working on these issues. We see state-sponsored LGBTI and transphobia in Hungary, in Poland, and we see the movement, the anti-gender movement, behind sponsoring also the government on these questions. So we really have to be very vigilant and defend these rights, because LGBTI rights, women's rights are human rights. And the last thing, I'm very impressed here in Argentina. I visited the trans house yesterday, on Monday. Your law here, you were the first country who have a law which is based on depathologization and on self-determination. This is very important. And many of us in Europe, we copied your law, so congratulations for your work you're doing here in Argentina, and I guess you're an example for the whole region here. So thank you very much, and And I have no question. I just wanted to call on if there's some parliamentarians, create an intergroup. If you need information, contact us in the European Parliament. We will tell you what we do, how we function. It is important. It's important because we are the link to civil society, and we are permanent in communication with civil society, and we are the bridge between the Parliament and governments and the Commission in Europe. In Europe. And therefore, I think it would be worth thinking of creating such a group. And I had contacts with some Argentinian members of parliament already, and I think they're on the way of creating a group like that. Thank you.
Hola, Mónica González.
Monica Gonzalez from the Socialists and Democrats. So first of all, congratulations, Alba. Your presentation was fantastic. It was really touched it, and in Latin America, I think you're showing some really good practices that come, and we in the European Parliament need to look to those and copy them, but not just activism until the law is adopted. And then the big thing is the implementation. So sometimes you can have a really advanced law, but then really high levels of persecution of LGBTI communities. So the proposal that I would say to the forum is really to look at, in 2019 in France, the constitution was amended, and perhaps our French colleagues could correct me if I'm wrong. They eliminated the concept of race, and race in every... I've heard that term used. In Spain, too, that's an open debate, and whether or not we're able to make progress in the meaning. I think that there's just one race, it's the human race, and with the words we use, we really impact the future that we would like to have. So my suggestion to this forum, where we are using our power of influence from the Parliamentary Assembly, let us not use the term race. There's only one race, and it is the human race. Thank you.
Bien. ¿Me estáis a escuchar? Bien.
Can you hear me? I will speak Spanish. I'll be speaking a bit of a mix between Spanish and Portuguese, but since there's no translation, I will speak in a mix of Spanish and Portuguese. I want to say that, Mariela, I'm here, I'm Portuguese, and I want to continue to bring my support to Marielle, and there's been no justice, and we keep following up on this. That's a member of the LGBT community, Black, Ecuador, that was fighting for the poor people's rights and LGBTQ community's rights, and who was assassinated, who was murdered. And so I would discuss that because I haven't heard you speak of it. And the authorities in various countries of Latin America should be the spearheading the efforts to defend the LGBTQ community against those who are part of these communities. And at times they are victims twice over, because they are victims of the community, of these attacks, of these assaults, of criminal groups, but they are also attacked a second time of the authorities that should help them in a different way in the justice system. So I think we really we need to address this issue too. Thank you.
Okay. If we are finished, now it's time for comments of speakers. Alba first.
Bueno, hasta que se encienda el micrófono, que arranque el compañero, porque.
I think the microphone is on. I would allow my colleague to speak first if he should like to.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Well, thank you for these comments. I think that this is a really important space that we've opened up here. Equally, and on behalf of thousands of people, I'd like to really thank you for giving me this space. I'll try to summarize in 1 and 2 minutes because we are already running against the clock. There are many things that still need to be done from a legal standpoint and also from a practical standpoint. Without a doubt, some countries, we know, have the law on the statute books, not all. In the English-speaking Caribbean, for example, there are laws against sodomy, for example, but in Latin America, it is true that we have laws that run counter to human rights standards in general and to the LGBTQI community as a whole. And so we're going to need to amend those laws, but we can't just look to those changes in laws, but completely overhaul our policy and our mindsets. It's important for that to make sure that we have those working in the public administration as well as in the justice system, that they be addressing this, seeing how that has an effect on the rights, as well as in the executive and stigmatizing language that is used in discourse. Much needs to be changed still. Civil society in the majority of countries are working on these themes, and when it comes to the question of race, well, the problem is the NGO is race. That's the name of my NGO. So it will be. That's about all I can say. You can see, but I can understand the way that you were conceptualizing it. Thank you.
Ahí está. Bueno, muchísimas.
Thank you very much indeed for bringing your comments to me. I would just open up a way forward to a certain extent, how we can take responsibility and use policy to make sure that it is responsibility as a driving force to change in our society, specifically within the reality of the LGBTQI community, because that is going to have an impact on their lives. Now, when it comes to representation, for one, but we know that we can't look just at it as a minority issue. These are political agendas that really impact us all, and they call on us all to protect and work for the fundamental rights, including human rights. So early death, torture, these are all things that I think we can rally around to try to change and make sure that we have participation around the about LGBTQI community representatives. So make sure that we're all speaking out on these subjects. Now, I think another point that is also important to underscore, to highlight, that many of the feminist and agendas run with the trans community. As trans women, we participate, we experience, we are part of all of this through our feminist activism, and so this cannot be overlooked. Misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, these are aspects that frequently talk about structural asymmetry for our daily lives. Of course, there are specific questions as well. One, and these need to be addressed. One of them would be, for example, work in the press. That seems fundamental to me, that messages that are being put forth in the media and in press be respectful, to uphold all that we have so hard fought for. Now, there are many things in terms of nuance, in terms of violence. There is a legal framework, but sometimes in practice it's not the same. And so I'm wondering where this observation comes from. In Latin America, we know that there are many cultural parameters that are extremely complex because of religion or conversion therapy. These are frequently conversion practices that take place in these spaces. So we have to, I think, address this from a point of responsibility related to creed, and that those religious spaces where many of these subjects are established and founded and then brought to other areas. And it is no coincidence that LGBTQI communities are the targets of religious communities. So that's no coincidence. So looking at the freedom of religion, but within a paradigm of rights. Finally, I think one of the big subjects that we see in Latin America and here is related very much to having a trans-feminist justice system. So not just highlighting or underscoring what is wrong or what we haven't yet achieved for Marielle. Here in Argentina, too, we have to flip the fascism for Diana Sakasham. And that we need to, when it comes to quota and work in our country. Though that she was a victim of a trans homicide in 2015, and a case was opened, and civil society rallied throughout the course of the process, and this was a historic case. So this is a transvesticide, and the decision was finally handed down without a mention of transvesticide. And so continuing to be active in all of these movements, showing the importance of the government, but the government in all its dimensions, so the legislative, the executive, but also in the judicial branch. This is fundamental for having these courageous debates with an audacious way. So making sure that we have a presence of democracy within our institutions consistently. Thank you.
Thanks, Alba. Are there other items to be discussed? Okay, thanks a lot. The exact date and the place of the next EuroLat meeting with civil society will be communicated at a later time, probably in Praga, in September in Praga. Many thanks to the participants for their presence and to interpreters, the technical team, of course, and the Secretariat for the excellent work. Thanks a lot again, and the meeting is closed. Thanks.
Un segundo.